All right, so we're at week 3. We're moving past method into the realm of apologetics, although today may feel still like we're talking about method because we're talking about building blocks, but in fact, you might think of it as a little bit of grammar, some of which you'll probably be very familiar with, but maybe be rusty on, some of which you may not be familiar with, but really all we're talking about is truth. And there's all sorts of ways that people try to get around the idea of truth. And here I don't just mean Christian truth or the whole truth or the biggest truth. I mean the very idea of truth, which is absurd. And that's the whole point. When somebody is being what we call a relativist or an extreme skeptic, they sound absurd because it is absurd. And they're not doing it because they are actually seeking for the truth. They're like Pilate in John 18, where he says to Jesus, "What is truth?" He's not asking. I always ask people, are you asking a question or are you using a question? He was doing that as sort of a passive-aggressive way to numb his own conscience from the evil that he was doing. And I think that's what we see when we see somebody denying something so foundational. But a lot of people do it. So what we're going to do today, that flows very nicely, 3, 4, 5, our 1, 2, and 3. But we're going to talk about 3 basic laws of logic. We're going to look at 4 building blocks of using logic. And then we're going to look at what I call 5 truths that no one does without, or non-negotiables. That's what I mean by that. Things that every single view of the world has to believe. And a lot of times we have to bring people back to that, to bring them back to their senses. This first, and by the way, they're going to flow here. It's going to start to, what we talked about last week, the classical method, the order, the 1 and the 2, going from philosophical truths, necessary truths, on to evidence. This is going to give us the logical DNA of how that functionally works. So let's first introduce the very idea of logic. And I say introduce, not to insult anybody's intelligence, but I think we live in a culture in which the very idea of logic has been slandered, I guess you could say, by pop culture even. Previous generation, they might have, when you think of logic, you might think of Mr. Spock. That's not logical. So what do you think of? You think of something very mechanical, very inhuman, very impersonal. If you don't go back that far, Generation X, as we came to age, there was the Matrix trilogy. And at the very heart of that series was the architect, in the second episode in particular, where logic was pit against love. And the way to get out of the system that was determined and everything like that was to choose love over logic. What's it doing? It's doing the same thing. It's making you think that it's this cold thing that's remote and removed from reality. But actually, logic is all about relationships. Not the ones you're thinking, but the relationship between truths and ideas and propositions. I defined it this way when we were doing our academy in Boise. I had the kids remember this definition. Logic is the rule of right reason. Now that's concise, but there's another advantage to defining it that way, and it's kind of picked up in this definition by Gordon Clark, and his definition is logic is the science of necessary inference. I like that because science and rule, it's suggesting an objective thing that just is what it is, whether we like it or not. Here, in these definitions, you're looking more at the art of, and they're right, they're good definitions and valuable. They're a little bit longer. So Isaac Watts, the hymn writer, you may be surprised, he wrote a textbook on logic. He said, "Logic is the art of using reason well in our inquiries after truth and the communication of it to others." Totally agree? But that's more like what we call the subjective definition. In other words, that's not a bad thing, but just like apologetics is both an art and a science, it's about things that are real, we're going to show the skeptic, but we're also doing something. Well, it's the same thing with logic. And then you have this other one in the 20th century by Maritain. He said, "Logic is the art which enables us to proceed with order, ease, and correctness in the act of reason itself." Again, good, but I always want to start people with, when I talk about rules of logic and laws of logic, I'm not talking about things, somebody will say, well, that's Western logic. Or Aristotle, that's just Aristotle no more invented logic than Columbus created America. I won't even say discovered. Because he discovered something in the nature of reality that was already there. Okay? All right, so let's get to these three basic laws. And you're just going to have to trust me on this. I mean, you could see that it's right and see what it means. But I always compared this back in the day, and I can't do this anymore, to people that are younger than Generation X because they don't know what I'm talking about. I compare this to the Karate Kid. You know, the original Karate Kid movie in 1984, whenever it came out. You know the theme, Daniel's son, he goes to learn martial arts from Mr. Miyagi, and he's expecting to learn how to defend himself and everything. He shows up on day one, and what does Mr. Miyagi do? Hands him a rag and says, wax on, wax off, right? On all of his cars. He shows up on day two, and he has paint the fence. He does this all day. And he shows up on day three, and he gives them a sandpaper. He says, sand the floor, and Daniel's son sands the floor. He comes on the fourth day, and he shows him all this stuff, and Daniel's son's like, what are you doing? I thought you were going to teach me karate. I thought you were going to teach me martial arts. And Mr. Miyagi says, show me wax on, wax off. And he starts doing it. He's like, nah. And he starts throwing punches at him. And all of a sudden, Daniel's son realized that he was developing what we call neuromuscular training, patterns. And that's kind of what I'm going to ask you to do right now, is just trust me. And in about 5-10 minutes, I'll start throwing punches. And you'll see how these show up everywhere. So here's the laws. One way the notation of it is A equals A does not equal non-A, and A or non-A, that V there, from a Latin word for or, it's where they get that symbol from, not versus, like in a court case, but or. That's the law of the excluded middle. But here's what they mean. Simple terms. The law of identity means that a thing is what it is and not something else. That's the implication. But you could just go with a thing is what it is. A equals A. Doesn't sound very exciting at first, but you'll be surprised how many times people go running off the reservation. The law of non-contradiction states that a thing is what it is. Sorry, I'm doing the other one, still waking up. That a thing cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same relation. And that clause there is actually very important because a lot of people think that they're getting around it because maybe they're saying, well, I was going 30 miles an hour and 60 miles an hour. Aha! Yes, at different times. And we'll see examples where you have to pay careful attention. The wording is crucial. The law of the excluded middle states that for anything that either is or is not, it either is or it isn't. Again, doesn't sound very exciting. Who would ever disagree with these things? And it's not so much that we just overtly disagree with them, but we lose our minds and we don't realize that this is what we're trying to get around. Now, I said Aristotle didn't invent this. I also say it's important to see that these laws are assumed by Scripture, and I'll go as far to say that they are oftentimes even supported or even suggested by different truths that come from Scripture. So, for example, the law of identity. Think of where the Lord introduces his name in Exodus 3:14, and it's very instructive that the Hebrew word that's used there, hayah, and I realize some people will try to say that, well, that's I will be. Well, whatever. No. The traditional rendering was, I am that I am. And I'm not sure that they would gain anything by that other translation anyway. But even the Lord's name, he is who he is. And that's a statement of being and ultimate existence. But then a verse that would assume the law of non-contradiction. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. It is in the very nature of God to be consistent, the divine mind. And so logic is, I showed you that definition by Gordon Clark. One of the things he argues that word in the Greek comes ultimately from the root logos, and we've already seen logos in John 1:1. Gordon Clark goes as far to say that in the beginning was logic. And some people say, okay, I get it, but maybe that's inflated a little too much. Can't reduce it to that. But his point is simply that it belongs to the divine nature, that God did not even create logic, that logic is a reflection on the human level, but it is a reflection of the divine reason. And then finally, the law of the excluded middle. You'll see this in any set of truths where they are opposed to each other in some argument of Scripture. So where Paul says in Romans 11, if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. What's he saying? It's either one or the other. Or Jesus' statement in Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. So Jesus is claiming, just as Paul was, that this is a genuine either-or proposition. There's tons of examples that you can show of that. Now, let me make a few mistakes just to clarify things. I said I was going to throw some punches. Sometimes you can clarify something by sneaking some things in to train people's minds so they can see it. Take this podium right here. You can see it. Is this an either-or proposition? Either this podium, I'm going to make a statement here, either this podium is brown or hard. That's obviously not even an either-or proposition, right? Because it can be both. You can see that. That's what we call the either-or fallacy, where you propose two or more sometimes, usually two propositions as if they're mutually exclusive, and in fact there's not. Maybe they both can be, or maybe there's a third option. There's two different ways to commit that error. Okay? And a lot of people will start to try to argue against that by saying, I mentioned Eastern logic. One of the subtle ways that that's argued is to say, well, that's either-or logic that you're talking about. But don't you know that there's also a lot of things that are both and, like I just showed it to you, right? This podium is both brown and hard. Well, let me ask that person a question if they want to say that there's a whole different kind of logic that's both and. So let me ask this. Is this state of affairs, this thing right here, that's both brown and hard, at the same time and in the same relationship, not brown or not hard? I know I've added a lot more words there, so that's a mouthful. But to that person that wants to say that, well, this is both and logic that I believe in. Okay. So is this podium that's brown and hard at the same time and in the same relationship not brown and not hard? No. And so that person also has to believe in the law of non-contradiction. So every situation in life, you'll hear sometimes, but don't you know there's gray areas in life? To which I would respond to that person, so there's not gray areas in life. They'll say, no, there are gray areas. Okay, no, I agree with you. So there are gray areas in life, and at the same time, in the same relationship, not gray areas. Well, no. You're borrowing from the law of non-contradiction. So every both and situation in life is also inside of the either-or. The either-or is supreme, and that's going to be a reflection of God's mind, that there's only one reality, and it has to be consistent. Okay? Let's really get simple to start to build this up. Now I'm throwing punches at you, but they're just little jabs. I always start people with these, not even full sentences. Square circles and married bachelors. What's wrong with the picture here? In simple terms, I'll throw it out to you. What's wrong with this? Square circles, married bachelors. You could take both or either one. What's wrong with these pictures? They're contradictory. In fact, even the word picture, think about it for a second. What's wrong with these pictures? Let's say I tried to draw a picture. I actually challenged a student to do that one time. I gave him the piece of chalk and said, okay, come to the front. Who wants to draw a square circle? And somebody, I guess, wanted to, and somebody even said one time, what about a boxing ring? Oh, boxing, because it's a square, and a ring, it's called a ring. Okay, that's called the fallacy of equivocation, where you change the meaning of a term. But in reality, no. The basic problem here is, as you said, they're self-contradictory. They contradict themselves. One term and another term is combining to make one reality when, in fact, both of those things are not the same thing. A married person just is a non-bachelor. A bachelor is a non-married person. Squares are, by definition, non-circular, and circles, by definitions, are squares, okay? And so they don't cohere. That's what we mean by incoherent. They don't stick together. Think of it like that, okay? So you can see how the laws of logic, those three laws, bring themselves to bear here, okay? So let me take it to the next level, and I call this expanding the brackets. And as a hint, if you're able to think on two tracks at once and multitask here, if you don't worry about it, because I'll bring it out. But as we expand the brackets to a full sentence, and that's all I mean by that, start to imagine that this is going to start to form. See, right now it's going to go down as I add examples. But what's going to start to form is a scoreboard going from left to right. And there's only two slots, so it's not going to be too busy. 1 and 2. And it's going to correspond to the classical apologetic method that we introduced last week. And what you're going to start to see is that the first column is sort of the logic round. A worldview is going to be subjected to logic. And if it can't pass that checkpoint, then it can't even get on to the second round. And we'll start to see why. And this idea of expanding the brackets is going to be the exercise that starts to train our mind in how to spot that and how to show that to the person that we're talking to. So expanding the brackets from terms to now whole sentences, or sentence fragments to whole sentences or propositions. Now, the example, I used to use this pen as not a pen because I didn't always have a chalkboard in front of me, but R.C. Sproul used this, and this is where I got it from. And he told the story, before I, you'll get it. I'm not going to ask you because you already got what's wrong. Obviously, the same problem is going to be here, except with a sentence here, you have a subject term and a predicate term, right? And then you have this verb here that's called a copula, but your terms are your subject and predicate term. So piece of chalk, interestingly enough. And here it's just the easiest way to contradict ourselves. This piece of chalk is not a piece of chalk. I don't remember what teaching it is, but when Sproul told this story, I guess he was in some seminary back in the day, and I guess it had been years since people studied logic in those days. I guess he was reintroducing it to the seminary world, because he introduced and he held up a piece of chalk and he said, okay, this piece of chalk is not a piece of chalk. What's wrong with this statement? And the students, struggled one by one. They would say something like, well, maybe the particles are underneath it or this and that. And then somebody else, well, maybe it's an illusion, or maybe he's holding a piece of styrofoam that looks like chalk. And then there was actually a professor in there too. He said, well, maybe it's, he thought he was trying to get really profound and everything. And so maybe it's the substance versus the accidents and all these different things. And Sproul's just sitting up there just waiting and waiting. And then finally it's dead quiet. Everybody's exhausted. And this black student from in the back of the room got up and said, man, I don't learn nothing from this jive. So it had to be the 70s. And Sproul immediately said, hallelujah, finally. Did you hear what he said? Repeat that. And he repeated it. He said, that's exactly the problem. It's jive. It's nonsense. It's a contradiction. People were thinking there's this really mysterious thing that he's trying to get into, but no, the whole point is that it contradicts itself, which is literally what contradictio in the Latin, you're speaking against yourself. Okay, so that's the idea of a contradiction. It's nonsense. It doesn't stick together. And so what's emerging here as we expand the brackets, because what I want to ask is just imagine this. What if I could expand the brackets not only from terms to sentences, but from sentences maybe to whole arguments made of 2 or 3 sentences, to then eventually whole theories, to eventually whole worldviews. And to do it in a way that's very simple because you do it at the very beginning of a worldview. That's a rhetorical question. What if? Well, in fact, we can, and that's the whole point. That's what logic does. So hold that thought, because what's going to emerge again, and I wish I made a separate slide for this, was this round 1, round 2, although we will when we introduce worldviews next week. But just to give you a hint that this is serving as a bridge to everything else we're going to talk about. Let's, in this middle section, I'll try to get as faster through this middle section so we can get to the third on non-negotiables. But now we're just adding some grammar. And I'm not going to cover this like I would a logic class, just this sort of a need-to-know basis here. We're going to use terms like this, valid and sound and deduction and induction. I'll use terms like syllogisms. I'll use a lot of examples of syllogisms, and so you'll want to know what a syllogism is. So let me just introduce a bunch of grammar here. The main grammar I'm going to be introducing are 4 words. Sound and valid are going to go together, and then deduction and induction are going to go together. Those first 2, sound and valid, that refers to basic tests that our words have to pass in order to be true representations of reality. The second 2, deduction and induction, are what we might call 2 lanes of traffic that our reasoning is always flowing. And so I do have to introduce it here because I'll be using that terminology throughout. Okay? And we'll get to a definition of truth as we go. But just in order to understand how truth is represented in these things called propositions, if I use the word proposition, just take it at the moment as just a synonym for sentence or statement. I'll use the word premise and conclusion. Premises, and there could be like 17. Think of it as an assumption. But it's just my reason to believe something else. And usually that last one, and that's just a therefore symbol, but don't worry about it, saves space for one. That's my conclusion. So an argument, whatever kind it is giving you reasons, showing my work, how I got to my conclusion. Now, this kind is called a syllogism, and it's made of 2 premises and a conclusion. And there have to be 3 terms. Don't ask me why. I'm going to teach Aiden logic this year, and I hope to get some things on video as I do it. So if anybody's interested, I'll show you then. But at this point, just know that this is what we're looking at. There's rules for it. It's not just willy-nilly. You can't just there has to be 3 terms. They have to be repeated twice, otherwise they violate the rules. Okay, but that's all we're going to mean by syllogism. And our first 2 words that I'm trying to introduce here are these tests. These 2 things that every argument has to be. Okay? So when we talk about soundness, this is super easy. That's just a syllogism. That's just a synonym for true. A sound statement, in this context, is a true statement, and a sound argument, in this context, is a true argument. That's why in this diagram, these sentences all point to the world. Because the question here, if the question is my argument sound? Are my propositions sound? I'm asking the question, does the proposition conform to reality? Is it real? How do I judge that? There's a historical method for historical questions. There's a scientific method for scientific questions, and so on and so forth. Okay? I'm checking out to see if the statement is true. That second word, we use it all the time, but we don't really understand what it means. Validity, in the context of an argument, refers to the form of the argument. Do the terms go together? Do the terms and the sentences follow each other in a way that doesn't violate the rules of logic? Is my form, you can have a syllogism that has 3 completely true statements and it's complete nonsense. They have nothing to do with each other, all right? And so the argument itself, just because all 3 statements are true, doesn't mean the argument's true, okay? And you could use lots of different examples of that. Now, the famous one that I don't want to say everybody starts with, but a lot of textbooks and classes will start with this. It's the Socrates syllogism. And it goes like this. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is a mortal. Now, if these 2 statements are true, and assuming all of my terms are in the right place, and if you want to know, if you're curious, there's 24 acceptable, valid combinations that you can put these terms, and only 24. Otherwise, they're invalid and they violate various rules. But if these are true, and everything's in the right combination, then this follows, as Sproul would always say, by resistless logic. This must be true. If these are true, and if this follows, then it is impossible that this not be true. this is necessarily true. No one can prove it to not be true. I'm saying it in a couple of ways to cement home the point. We know this with certainty. Not an ounce of probability. Not an ounce of uncertainty. People, well, I'm not certain about that. Aha, but you're not logic. It's because you fail to understand what we're talking about at this point, but in itself, it is invincible. Now, somebody could say to this, okay, but what good is it for this to be valid if your terms are not true? These have to be, I've got to go out here to the world with my microscope or asking historical sources or whatever, depending on what the question is, to find out whether or not these are true. So, for example, let me throw a monkey wrench in this. What if Socrates, turns out, is just the name of my cat? Ha-ha! Okay, well then you've committed the fallacy of equivocation. That doesn't tell us anything else. That if we mean Socrates, that dude in the toga that taught Plato that stuff, back in the 4th century BC, well then no, it's not your cat. So you've equivocated here. You haven't done anything to logic. Well, what if somebody says, actually though, it turns out that all men are not mortal. Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And he, being the Son of God, has immortality in himself. Aha! Okay, good point. That's true. Nevertheless, if what we mean by this term is all men born to the race of Adam, in the normal way that somebody would mean this syllogism, then it's true. Okay? And really, if you want to switch that to mean something else, then really you haven't done anything to logic. This still follows. If these sentences are sound and true about the world, then it absolutely follows. Now, why does this matter? That's interesting, but it seems a little boring and irrelevant to the question of somebody who's actually an unbeliever. Well, we're starting to form mentally in our minds, and I'll draw it out next week in a slide. We're starting to form that scoreboard. And again, there's only 1 and 2. Those are your columns. And the first column is the logic round, the logic checkpoint. And if you caught it last week, one of the things I'm claiming is that nobody's getting out of that first room except for Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And there's ways to show that even they shouldn't really be allowed out of that first room. Only Christian theism really can graduate. But that's a little tougher. On the surface, the monotheistic religions at least now move on to the evidential round. Every other worldview, atheism, agnosticism, and we'll show this in the coming weeks, can't even get out of that first round. So just like I don't need graph paper, I don't have to waste a single sheet to try to draw that square circle. I don't have to send a single census worker out into the county to find a single married bachelor, because no matter how many houses he knocks on and how many pieces of graph paper I waste, I will never draw a square circle, and I will never find a married bachelor. And there will never be a piece of chalk that's not a piece of chalk. And in many, many other ways... Oh, that was a silly example. Oh yeah, I wanted to illustrate. I think I kind of covered this already in the way I said it, but a lot of times textbooks will use ridiculous examples to cement home a point. This was an example, I was supposed to put it up there earlier, of a statement where, well, no, this is not an example of that. This is one that, I'll read it first and then I'll ask you a question. Everything, premise 1, everything made of green cheese is edible. Highly dubious. Second premise, the moon is made of green cheese. I'm going to go on a limb and say that's false. Therefore, the moon is edible. Now, but let me ask you a question right away. Is this argument valid? It's a valid argument. It's complete nonsense. And I don't recommend anybody try that, the green cheese thing. It's an unsound, untrue argument. Because the propositions are untrue. This very high degree of probability, this I'm pretty certain of it. But it's an unsound argument. And I had other examples to show how you can have all true statements, unlike this, and yet the argument's invalid. But I think you get the point. So this is where I wanted to go next. Here's the beginning of the scoreboard starting to form. Now I've put valid and sound moving from left to right. Okay? Suppose somebody wanted to build an entire worldview on top or inside of a square circle. And suppose he said many true things. No, water boils at 212 inside my square circle. Water does boil at 212. Wait, but if it rests on a square circle, this conversation's over. You're already disqualified. And you're making it depend on that, by the way. Now, what about this one? Married bachelors. Suppose he says a lot of true things about married bachelors. You get the idea. Same thing there. Can we convert this into some real things? Nobody actually believes this nonsense. But some people will say this: all views are culturally relative. Now mark that person. A second later, he'll start saying that your culture is immoral. You ever hear this? The God of the Bible does terrible things. Wait a minute, aren't you the person that just said 5 minutes ago that all views are culturally relative? But don't you know that their God in their day, and who are you to judge them, thought that was perfectly moral? If all views are culturally relative, then by what standard, and here's where I will agree with the presuppositionalists in their question, by what standard? It's a very good question. But it has to be targeted and not sort of a clanging cymbal where you just say it, and then you have to explain yourself. Here's what's going on. Or somebody that said, and this is much more down, that's a little bit easier to see. But a little bit tougher to see, and when we do our week on science, we'll see it. All views must be falsifiable. All human propositions have to be falsifiable. Now, in order for a scientific statement to work out, it has to be, in principle, falsifiable. In other words, by repeated experimentation and so on, you can disprove or falsify the hypothesis. Question: is the falsifiability principle falsifiable? Or the scientific method, or quantity, or any number of other things that all science needs in order to do its business? Or what empirical science studies the falsifiability principle? So in other words, this is going to run into the law of non-contradiction. Because if you say that there's no possible world in which the falsifiability principle can be falsified, then you're taking it out of the realm of science. But if, on the other hand, and then science is not the highest court of appeals, if, on the other hand, you say that it can be falsified, well, then it's not the highest court of appeals, the principle of falsity. Now, that's a little tougher to get into. But they'll march on from this to be able to say stupid things like this, that intelligent design is unfalsifiable. You're just asserting some supernatural cause. This is just creationism again, under some, changed form and so forth. And so they'll rule that out. Now, this is tougher to see how this is self-contradictory, and so they can't move on to that. This is a little bit easier to see, but here's my point, is that if your whole house is built on a foundation that is not a foundation, you've got sinking sand there. Okay, and the whole thing is going to collapse. And our job as apologists is not even to wait for the collapse, to show up as good inspectors and to say, you don't have a foundation there. And so actually this thing that you're calling a house is a vapor. It's already down in a sinkhole. It can't rise on the basis of nothing. It's not standing on any ground. So that's where we're going to keep this scoreboard with us everywhere we move. The logic round is number one. Nobody's getting out of there except for the monotheistic faiths, and then we turn to evidence. Okay, let's move on. I just said that in a different way, so we're going to fast forward past that. So that's my first bit of grammar, valid and the sounds. You understand what that means? This is the form of the argument. Is it consistent? Does it match up to the real world? And you need both, but you need this first. The valid has a kind of priority over the sound. Because, one more thing on this. Because the temptation, when you looked at Socrates, maybe he's my cat, or what about the immortal thing, and what about the green cheese? This is just a logic trick. At first that's very understandable to fall into that temptation. But the more discerning person is going to realize, as you look at this more and more and more, that yes, it is true that while there is more truth in a fully sound argument, so you see that, there's more truth in a fully sound argument, there's no truth in an invalid argument. An invalid argument can't even get off the ground. So that's going to start, that's the logic of these scoreboards. This is not just, well, the classical guys do it this way. What we're saying is, no, that's the very nature of reality. And I said that last week. Well, logic and the way it works is the first way to show that, and it's really the right first way to show that. The last bit of grammar I'll just throw in real quickly is deduction and induction. You'll hear me use that kind of language. This is kind of what math does and what logic does, but really, and then you say this is what science and history do. That's true in general. It's an oversimplified picture. The reality is, even when I do the scientific method the way I learned it in third grade, first you observe, you go outside and with your magnifying glass and you look at butterflies, and isn't that interesting? And you start forming a picture, a hypothesis based on what I've observed. That's true. It's an oversimplified picture. In reality, this circle, my magnifying glass, like the cameraman in the nightly news, I decide what's newsworthy, right? And so my will and to point it where I will, and then the presuppositions I have that I say that this is what is newsworthy. So I have assumptions, I have presuppositions going into that. So it's a very simplified picture. Nevertheless, there is a basic 2 lanes of traffic that our reasoning flows. We can go from general or universal truths to specific applications of that truth. Or we can move this way and see all these fuzzy, 4-legged things. They reproduce, they eat these kind of foods, meat eaters versus not. And then I notice I have the lizard outside of that circle. At first I was going to put them in the same group, but now there's some different things about them. So you have the science of taxonomy. You arrange them into kingdom, phyla, genus, species, all that stuff. When I do that, I started with particular blips of data, particular instances of things, and a general picture started to emerge. That's why the arrows flow this way to a more general or universal picture. You can see why this is what science does. It's what history does. But here, though some people in the modern world may think that you're not starting with real things because they're invisible, nevertheless, I'm chopping off a larger slice of reality, and then everything that fits in that circle has to follow. So, if everything that begins to exist requires a cause, so here I have a big circle, and I'm going to call that big circle effects. Man, that's not a small thing. That's everything. Especially if I'm a materialist and I don't believe in anything that just is, except for maybe the universe itself, which we'll come back to. But then everything that begins to exist requires a cause. Well, if that's true, and if life began to exist, and even the evolutionist has to believe that, then life requires a cause. Again, that might not sound very exciting, but I've just narrowed down the field big time in where we have to focus on the origin of life in this case, but it could be any number of things. When I was trying to teach the kids at this academy, even down to an early age, the power of deduction over induction, and the way that people thought for 2,500 years, and they built the civilization because of it, and that's why they built the civilization. This, if that's all we had, would be more like animal thinking. We would just be walking this way and coming up to things and picking at them, and we'd never be able to abstract or draw circles around things. And that's not to say anything wrong about science or history or those kind of studies. But without this, that would be animal thinking. That would just be instinctual. That's not actually reason unless this is operating too. And so one of the ways I would try to teach this, I would play the game 20 questions. And I would train these kids with the use of this game 20. And if you don't familiar with the 20 questions, it's like the old version, I think, is animal, mineral, vegetable, if you've ever played that. But the whole idea is, I'm thinking of a thing. It's my turn. I'm thinking of a thing. And they all have to guess. And kids at first, they don't get it. They're like, my dog. And I'm like, okay, that's pretty specific. Can we start general? And the whole idea is your first guess should be something like, is it living? If I say no, okay, shifting over to non-living, right? If I say yes, then you can shift over, is it human? Okay, and then human, is it a famous person? Yes. Is it an actor? Okay, now I might have just got lucky there, but in 4 guesses, I just narrowed this down big time. And in the process I've eliminated all the rabbit trails that we really should not be talking about to narrow down the question to this. And so what I'm doing there is I'm training their minds to start thinking about the speed and the power of this. This is what drives reason. So when we talk about logic and philosophy, that's what we're talking about. And again, for 2,500 years, people had to learn this. They had to know it. For the past 100 years, we've gotten rid of it. And it's a very foreign thing. It's bizarre when you hear some of the things that people think logic and philosophy are. But this is the key to getting back to normal. All right. Again, the scoreboard, that's why it mattered, et cetera, et cetera. But let's move on. You get the idea. That's what deduction and induction are. Oops, sorry. Let's go back to this. This last section, 5 non-negotiables. In other words, let's put it this way. 5 things everybody has to start with, and this will help you even if they want to deny it. It'll be an easy process, or at least something you've got to work on, getting them back to see what's wrong with their foundations. And remember, everything here is in that first column. So it's a simplified way to keep bringing them back to that point of departure. And 2 places you can read about this are, I think it's the 2nd or 3rd chapter, just a very small section in Norman Geisler's book, and he co-authored this with this guy, Bocchino, but it's called Unshakable Foundations, where he supplies 2 of these, existence and logic. But in 2 of Sproul's books, Classical Apologetics, these showed up, but then when he did Defending Your Faith, about 20 years after, analogy was added to it in a more succinct way. And so I just combine these and call them 5 truths that nobody does without. And you can show that and need to show that. It becomes very powerful. Let's look at the first 2. Here's what Geisler wrote about existence and logic. Existence and human reason are the 2 most fundamental assumptions that all people have in common. These 2 assumptions are unavoidable. Let me stop right there. I'm not going to get too much into method again. I don't want to beat a dead horse or the presuppositionalist. But when you say fundamental assumptions or most fundamental assumptions, he's not talking there about ultimate commitments, like I am personally committed to, for example, God's word or God himself. That's a separate question. And that's one of the things that presuppositionalism has done. It has blurred these questions as if they're one. We're talking to an unbeliever. And even if you say, yeah, but Romans 1 says they really do believe, they're suppressing it. We know. So I've got a choice here. I can keep beating them over the head like a noisy, clanging cymbal and say, you really do believe this, you really do believe this. People who are bystanders, look, we're not the Holy Spirit. We can't convert them, and we can't convert the bystanders. But nobody's going to be very impressed if all we say is, oh, you're just saying that, or you're just saying that. By what standard? By what standard? Well, I'm not going to budge. I'm not going to budge. That's not a conversation. You sound like a small child. And it's not, and people pick up on that. They're not going to respect that, and no one should respect that. If you're in a conversation with somebody who disagrees with you, even if they're pretending and suppressing, we know they are, you want to have an intelligent conversation that brings it back to things that everybody has. You want to pin them down. And you're not doing that if you're just speaking in obscurities. Okay? So we want to show them how everybody has to assume this, even for all the nonsense that you want to bring against the Christian worldview. So, Geisler continues. These 2 assumptions are unavoidable. In order to deny existence and reason, one would have to use reason to think about the denial. Further, one would have to exist in order to be engaged in the reasoning process. I think a lot of people maybe get impatient with this when you say, that's true, but where are we going? Where are we going? I don't know. Do you have somewhere to go? That's my response. I think people are it's either intellectual laziness or maybe an anxiety. This doesn't seem to be working. Working? What is this? A fast food drive-through or something? Like a snapping of the fingers or a Vulcan death grip, and you're just going to convert them in 2 seconds? Have some patience here. Now, suppose somebody wants to deny that. No, I don't have to assume either reason or existence. How does Geisler reply to that? He says this. And there's all different forms of this. Maybe we're part of a simulation. The Matrix. Maybe, okay. Let's work with that. Geisler says, if objective reality did not exist, in other words, if you say, maybe reality is have you ever heard somebody say that? Maybe reality is an illusion. If objective reality did not exist to provide a contrast, there would be no way to know about the illusion. In other words, in order to know that we are dreaming, or if it's an illusion, we must have some idea of what it means to be awake. Only then can we contrast the two states. Similarly, we only know what an illusion is because we have some idea of what it means to be real. If everything were really an illusion, we would never come to know about it. Absolute illusion is impossible. Think of this in a different way. Now, I don't expect that you've maybe read these sources, but the famous example of, come back to this, Descartes, René Descartes, 1637 wrote a book called Discourse on Method, and where he famously he tried to doubt everything he could possibly doubt, and then he came to this place where he realized that he was thinking. And so he said, well, I think, therefore I am. And a lot of people misunderstand that and all that it was trying to prove versus what's that. And you might be interested to know also that he wasn't the first to say it. Augustine beat him to it by over a millennium. Augustine, in 3 different books, had said, even if I am doubting, in fact, even if, and Descartes picked up on this in a later book, he said, well, suppose there's an evil genius somewhere, like the worker of a matrix, somebody casting some illusion on us, whatever it is. Suppose I'm deceived. And Descartes said, well, even if I am deceived, I must exist. Do you see the reason why? The one who is thinking, or even doubting if you want to go there, or even being deceived if you want to go there, must exist in order to think or doubt or be deceived, to be under some error or to be under some spell or to be under an illusion has what in common? To be. We can see that any argument against being has to assume it, and so it violates the law of non-contradiction. Any such argument will exist. It will be made by someone who exists in a world that exists. And even if they want to say, and there's a view called solipsism, which is the view of insane people literally, because insanity is what? It's to lose your touch with the outside world. And so solipsism is the belief that everything is an extension of my own mind. I don't have to believe in a world. I can believe in reason, like you said, and I exist, but everything's an extension. Well, even there, that must exist. Now, there's reasons to actually poke at that too, but that's another story for another day. But the point is that this view contradicts those basic laws of logic. But it also implies mind, not just existence. And that relationship about the necessity of there being something and the necessity of thinking about it implies a relationship between them. And that's what we saw logic really is. And so Geisler talks about these 2 non-negotiables. Sproul talks about these 4. And so now I'm going to bring him into the discussion, his 4 non-negotiables. But one of the things Sproul says is that you'll notice that when people try to get around the law of non-contradiction in any way, that, as he says, their denials of logic are always forced and temporary. In other words, when they do it, they have to contort even their own words, and it's always short-lived. Then they'll start arguing again for things that have to assume logic. But just remember, everything has to assume logic. You cannot utter a statement and want to be taken seriously unless you are assuming that your language is actually consistent with the world and consistent with itself. So just remember that priority of the valid over the sound. If anybody tries to state that mind or logic is invalid, that it's relative, that it's merely pragmatic, it's useful, that it's a product of chemical reactions, or even that it arose from survival traits. Well, those survival traits would not have done very well if human thinking didn't correspond to the way that the world actually is. It wouldn't have had a survival function. We'll get to that when we get to evolution and so on. But all these different arguments against logic always assume those laws of logic. They have to. Okay, let's move on to the next one here. Causality. Now, you might look at those and say, okay, I get how every view has to assume this, I think I could come up with arguments against this, and people do, because these suggest a necessity of truth. In other words, things that must be in any possible world that can be imagined. But what about cause? Now, that's just the way it is in our world. That's one of the main objections against it. In fact, one of the things you'll hear when you hear people trying to argue against the very nature of truth is materialists will start to say, well, I believe in facts, but not truth, as if those are fundamentally different things. And Christians can often slip into that distinction. So I'm going to give you a definition of truth too, which I don't have a slide for. But one of them that was offered by Anselm, and he was in the turn of the 12th century, but he wrote a little book on truth, and he said that, here's what we mean, that any such proposition is true when it signifies, our sentence, when it signifies that what is. And again, that sounds like too simple to be true, but here's a way to say it for us. Truth is correspondence between thought to reality. So what is truth? It is mind matching up to the real world. Now there's different views of truth, because you look at that and say, well, what other kind of truth can there be? People come up with ones. It's kind of silly, and we'll talk about some of them along the way. But causality. No, it's not just something that happens to be in our universe. This has to be true no matter what you look at in reality. That's a fundamental misunderstanding. It's a formal law. Sproul explains it like this, and then we'll get into the main objection that's been leveled against it. He says, when a statement is analytically true, or definitionally true, it's true by definition. That is, if one analyzes the words within the statement, their relationship to each other, and here we're talking about cause and effect. Every effect has to have a cause. Every cause has to have an effect. Okay, that's the principle of causality. If you analyze the words within the statement, their relationship to each other, then it's clear that by its very definition, it has to be true. An effect, by definition, is something that has been caused by something else. The word cause is also self-evidently defined, for it, by definition, brings about some kind of result or effect. A cause cannot be a cause unless it produces an effect. We cannot have a cause without an effect. Thus, all causes have effects, and all effects have causes is an analytic statement and must be true. Now, when you put it like that, and there's no reason not to, then all of a sudden you realize, okay, causality as a principle is actually higher than or bigger than or transcendent to this world. It doesn't depend on particular instances of causes and effects. Because you could say, well, I can imagine a cause that just doesn't have an effect, or an effect that which you can't, but that people misunderstand things like the quantum leap and other such things as instances of that, and they're not. And the mistake they're always making is they don't see this as a formal principle. Why is that? One culprit is this guy, David Hume. He was in the 18th century, Scottish skeptic philosopher. And he was often accused of denying causality. He didn't actually deny the principle. What he denied was that we can know, here's dominoes, usually it's a pool table that's used for the illustration or something like that. But he didn't deny that every effect has to have cause. He was denying that our reason or our senses could actually see down into the power of causality. In other words, that we can actually assign the actual cause to any effect. We see at the surface. We see things as they happen over and over again. The rooster crows, the sun rises. Or is it the sun rises and the rooster crows? Is that circular? And he wasn't trying to get us to be silly. He was just saying, we can't know. We can't penetrate down into the level to know what's ultimately being caused. Now, why is he doing this? Because he wants to throw shade on causal arguments for God's existence. Because if we can't know a cause immediately on a pool table, much less can we know the ultimate cause or the first cause and so on. So Sproul summarizes the argument of Hume. He says, what he said was that when we observe events around us that follow one another in time, we assume that the previous event actually caused the subsequent event. Since we observe this on a regular basis, we assume that these events are always caused by what preceded them. Hume called these customary or contiguous relationships. So by custom, we associate these things, but we don't actually know or see them. Now, leaving aside, because we're going to come to it, how we answer Hume about the first cause, he actually cuts off the branch he's sitting on. He's a modernist. He likes science. He at least wants to believe that we can know our universe. But what's the first difficulty in overthrowing this idea of cause and effect to the skeptic? Science. It isn't just arguments for God's existence that go, but science itself would have to be overthrown if we cannot know cause and effect, because science runs on knowing causes from effects or effects from causes. Quickly, getting to analogy here, and this is a little headier, but I'll quickly go through it. BT just stands for a believer talking about the word thing. So the word here is thing. It could be any word. What this is teaching is that we have to assume that there is an analogical use of reason. Why? Because there was always a big debate. And this debate actually happened between Gordon Clark and Cornelius Van Til when they were talking about the difference between what man knows versus what God knows. At one extreme, Clark's extreme, you could say, no, there has to be an absolute identity between the truth as it is in God and the truth as we know it. Van Til was saying, no, there is no similarity. Now, that, us versus God, can be flipped on its side, man versus man. And in this case, the believer versus the unbeliever. When the believer says the word thing versus an unbeliever saying the word thing, Van Til would say they mean two totally different things. Now, that's where Clark's interesting, because he's a presuppositionalist as well. But it's two different brands. We would say, and there have been people that have said, I wouldn't say this, people that have said the extreme, that they always mean the exact same thing. There's never any equivocation. Of course, they would admit people do mean they talk past each other, but it always means the exact same thing. And on the other extreme, you would say, no, our words bear no relationship to other people's words, and more importantly, our words bear no relationship to the thing themselves. Well, both of these positions, these extremes, lead to all kinds of absurdities. And so one person, Aristotle, talked about this, and so did Thomas Aquinas, and this is sort of the majority position, because everything else is irrationality, that our words are actually analogies. And what's an analogy? It's likeness. It's not utter sameness or identity, but it's also, this has nothing to do with that. No knowledge. No, somebody says, well, how much are our words like the thing, like reality? The answer is enough. You know, some people will cite Isaiah 55, 7 and 8 to say this, that, well, God's ways are not our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. When I read that verse, I see two things. I see likeness and unlikeness. We're like God in one sense. He has thoughts, we have thoughts. He has ways, we have ways. We're created in His image. But His thoughts are infinitely above our thoughts. His ways are infinitely above our ways. So there's analogy. The other two positions lead to absurdities. Now, we could debate that all day long, but because of the time, I just have to state what's actually being said. The whole point here is that every view has to assume this, or our words would make no sense at all. Okay? And then finally, you come to this. And some people would say, well, how is this on this list? These things must be true in every possible world. No matter who you are, no matter what you're trying to prove, you have to assume these. And these will lead to very uncomfortable things about the existence of God. But all we're saying at this point is that you can't do without them. Whereas this, supposing, from a Christian perspective, supposing God never created a world, well, then there wouldn't be any senses. Or you could say, I can imagine a universe in which there are no senses, but minds, I'm not even sure how to end the sentence. And I certainly can't believe in physical sciences if I don't believe in the basic reliability of sense perception. So why is this on this list? Well, Sproul, Gerstner, and Lindsley explain. This is from Classical Apologetics, and I'll end here. Our senses are limited but not impotent. They are problematic but not useless. With all these qualifiers, how can we be sure that our senses are even basically reliable and not distortive? We cannot. That is why we are left with the common sense necessity of assuming it. The reliability of sense perception must be a working presupposition if knowledge of the external world is to be possible. And here's the kicker. I don't think any of you would want to say, well, fine, I'll do without the external world. I won't argue on the basis of science and history, but they bring up the problem with that. It is part of the nature and order of knowing simply because it is the part of the nature or order of our being as physical, sensory-equipped creatures. Sense perception is a given of our ontological makeup. It can be augmented and enhanced, but it cannot be eliminated. The human body is the person's point of contact with the external world, the bridge from subject to object. We are creatures of sense perception. From this given, there is no exit. You say, well, I'll just go with the Bible. You're looking at the page. That's how you got it. I'll go with the audio Bible. You've got an ear. You're not getting out of this. Same thing with the atheist. He's getting his information, so he says, from the external world. So you have to assume this no matter what view you take. Otherwise, you're in the loony bin. Okay? So that's why. And you say, well, nobody's going to doubt these. False. You start backing people in a corner, most people will start to doubt one of these five or multiple of them. Give them a chance. They'll start trying to, and their lunacy will come out. And that's why you want to know how to pin them down on this.